fabulous Melanie Gillespie, who has her beautiful lake behind her, which there's such a story to that I'm sure she's going to get into, right? I'm going to tell you like the professional side of her and then the personal side that has been meaningful to me. So, Melody is an esoteric mystic who previously spent 30 years seeped into hard human sciences that inform human flourishing and the failure to thrive. I know you're very trauma informed, right? Which is going to be an important piece for our listeners. She has her MBA as a novelist as well. And in her private client practice, she works exclusively with other highly gifted humans. And that is both in how creativity works, which I know a lot of our audiences is very creative in nature, and who really have a desire to unlock their gifted brain into full integration access. And on a personal note, I have hired Melanie to work with me. I think my son is like destined to work with her in the future. At some point, we've talked about the like so many similarities of the two of you. And really the, her Luminosity podcast, we were in a coaching program together years ago. And when everything was crazy happening post-COVID, I started listening to her podcast again. And it was like, man, she's like dead on, man. That's exactly what's going on with me, man. That's exactly what I'm experiencing. So, Melanie, welcome to the Toxic Person Proof podcast. How are you?
Oh my God, I'm fantastic. It's so great to be here with you, Sarah. Just love it, love it, love it. You are such a light, and it's just a delight to be here.
Oh, well, I'm delighted to have you. And I'm delighted about our subject too, because one of the things when I was going through your course is the deep understanding of personal sovereignty, right? And that idea of like, I remember our first call and our call ran over, you and me got to talking, right? And I said, oh, I'm sorry that the call ran over. And you said, well, I'm in charge of my own boundaries. Why are you apologizing? I thought, yes, this is my person. So I know like even examples like that. And I mean, the work I've done, right? Yeah. So it's like, man, I'm on the tail end of this, right? Or I don't know if it is an end, but I've put in extensive work. So I know my listeners also struggle.
You're in the extreme refinement phase. That is where we all land if we get through all the rest of it, is how I like to think of it. Because the rest of our lives is just that refinement piece. But boundary work is so fundamental, so foundational. So I love that example. You'd be probably not surprised, given your background, how often that happens.
Yeah.
That I'll let a call run long and somebody goes, oh my God, I'm sorry, I'm taking so much of your time. And I'm like, you don't have to take care of my boundaries. That's my job. I'm good.
Yeah. I think I was more surprised that I said that, after giving my work, I was like, oh, I'm surprised I said that. But why don't you talk? I loved your video on personal sovereignty, which is part of her program. It's not something you guys can find online, but it was just a great lesson in that personal sovereignty is a continuing lesson. I am actually very good at it, and I still have refinement work, right? And so wherever we are in our journey, there's always, something to refine in that. So why don't you give us some insight into that?
Sure. Absolutely. I love it. I mean, personal sovereignty is one of those topics that people love to talk about, and they love to kind of throw around the idea of like, I'm a sovereign being. It means different things to different people. They interpret it in different ways. But what I will tell you is that virtually no one walking around on the planet at this time actually has the capacity to live in that personal sovereignty. Like, yes, we are all sovereign beings in theory. That doesn't mean that we're living that way. And so what I find is the most effective way to kind of unpack and get started with personal sovereignty is absolutely boundaries, for sure, which is just fundamental. We absolutely have to have it. I work with boundary work on 3 levels. So there's the inside boundaries, because boundaries are basically just your yes and no, right? Like that inner compass, and learning how to be able to hear that inner yes and no can actually be a radically difficult thing for people to do after decades of being programmed to not listen to that and having it sort of like encrusted and covered up. And then the obvious interpersonal, like you and me and our boundaries together, that's the one that gets the most airplay. And then there's also, I did say I'm an esoteric mystic. So there's also the energetic side, or the spiritual, or the woo side around your boundaries. And we don't have to go into the woo, but It's still there, whether people are into it or not. And I
Most
just want to also address, sometimes people ask me, what do you mean by esoteric mystic? And what I mean by that is that I'm not nested in a particular spiritual or religious tradition, right? So like you might, there are Christian mystics, there are Buddhist mystics. And the idea of a mystic, from my perspective, is simply that I am very directly tied into, if you will, source, love, God, the universe, whatever, here in this particular cosmos, in my own received understanding and experience, we are really all about our kind of connection and expression of what I call the deep sacred current of life force. And so that is what my devotion as a mystic in my entire life is about. But so back to personal sovereignties, right? So I can actually bring it back around for you. So personal sovereignty, yes, boundary work is really kind of where it starts. But then we get up into these really important areas of, to what degree am I able to be in the moment, live in the moment at cause versus at effect? And without going too deep into any of this, most of us are at effect all the time. You can think of kind of like a big circle, a big bullseye circle, and in the very middle, there's being at cause, which means you are in charge of your own experience in that moment, rather than letting external circumstances or people or whatnot be in charge of your experience. This is much harder to do than people think. And it is not the same as, it doesn't work when you do kind of denial or bypassing, like, that doesn't work at all. It's a total mess when we do that. And then nest that in the concept of, can we come into being in neutrality in regards to all other beings? And again, as a mystic, for me, as an esoteric mystic, pretty much everything is a being. A stone is a being, a tree is a being, all the humans are beings, stars are beings, even the galaxy is a being, etc. So am I in a kind of a one up or a one down place in my inner location related to another being? One down, I'm looking up with a like, oh, please, love me or approve of me or take care of me or validate me or whatever. One down is that kind of, I'm in judgment where I'm, I might think I'm better than you, or I might sort of pity you. There's a million different things. So personal sovereignty begins, the access to living in personal sovereignty begins when we can get into that nexus of cause and neutrality. Sounds easy, not easy.
No, it's not easy at all. And so many of my listeners were in the down position for so long. And so if you're listening to this, it is very normal. And I know you're very trauma informed, Melanie, to like have to go to the one up position of kind of judgment before you get to the neutral position. Yeah. Right.
Yep. No, totally. That pendulum can swing, and that's totally fine. It's totally normal. And that it's just useful to understand, I think, that that's what you're doing, and then let yourself do it. But don't think that just because the pendulum swung over here and now you have that holier than thou, I'm better than, that you're done. Because you won't be happy over there either for very long. It can be really useful for that kind of reclaiming of power if you've been in a really difficult, toxic relationship. And, whether that's in a romantic relationship or work relationship or family relationship, it doesn't really matter. If you've been tightly involved in a very toxic relationship, and I am very trauma informed, and I did spend decades creating programs for people that were based on the sciences. So the mystic was, if you will, closeted in the boardroom for many years when I was running large organizations. But it's a tricky thing. And for folks that are listening who are used to talking from that trauma-informed perspective, I want to also bring in this issue of the neurobiology. So the nervous system and the brain, the neurobiology system, goes through certain programming in the first 7 years of our life. And this is actually how we then are organized for the rest of our lives. And it dictates and runs not just what our behavioral patterns are, but who we end up in relationships with, and also literally how we see reality. Mm-hmm. So, we're not here to have the big, long philosophical discussion about, is there any such thing as objective reality, right? Like, I could do that all day long, but from what's useful at a tactical level, reality changes based on what your brain is allowing you to perceive, and in what way. And we can just, again, staying in pure science realms and research realms, we can see tons of research that show us that this is actually why eyewitnesses are so notoriously unreliable and have such different accountings of the same events. People growing up in the same family, completely different memory of the same events, because it's all being filtered by how the neurobiological structures, if you will, inside the human is set up. And so one of the things that I think is also really helpful for people to be aware of is that that doesn't mean you have to spend 500 years or even 5 years like in therapy. You don't. There are so many different ways to work with this that don't require you to kind of spend a whole bunch of time tromping around painfully like in the past, in whatever, I don't think I should probably use bad language on here, but in whatever the crappy crap, you can do, your 4-letter version of that we might have been dealt with in the early years. But it is just really important to understand that. And one of the reasons that's so important, and I want to bring this up because I think this is really important to your people, as you're moving out of being in a toxic relationship, one of the things that you've probably been dealing with is various versions of being gaslit, being, told that you're crazy or that you're the problem. And as you're trying to get back into the capacity to figure out, how do I hear my own gut intuition? Because now on the other side of it, I feel like, oh, I should have listened to my intuition. Like I knew blah, 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 blah. It's fair if you've been in a traumatic situation for a long period of time to actually, instead of beating yourself up around, oh my God, I knew I should have. Did you know? Did you actually really know? Because on some level you might have, but your nervous system and your intuition are actually two different things. And until you do that kind of deprogramming and then like reclaiming of your neurobiology, you may not actually be hearing from your true soul, from your true intuition, however you want to define intuition. There's a million ways of thinking about that. You may not be hearing from your actual gut. You may actually be hearing from like little 3-year-old you or 18-month-old you or in utero you, who's been running the show from the start, which is true for all of us, even without any trauma or problems in our childhood. The most amazing childhood, the function of the human neurobiology is to, in fact, then figure out over roughly 7 years, how does this thing called life work? Okay, great. We're going to put into place some core childhood directives, behavioral directives for how to optimize it. So everybody has that. And the only way, and if they're a problem for us, that's when we want to kind of really pay attention to them. Other times they might not be a problem for people and they don't care. But for some of us, we're like, I want to have, when back to personal sovereignty, I want to have a greater access to, if you will, my core essence, to my core magic that my soul wants to express in this human lifetime. So I think it's really an important thing to be able to give yourself the room to understand. I may not actually know what my intuition is. Just like I may not actually know what my yes and no boundary is. And that's okay. And then the first, and then the first boundary is to tell everybody, I don't know, and piss off until I do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that you have the space. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm so glad you brought it back around to that, because that was when you first talked, you said, that internal yes and no is the first boundary, right? Because it's not the boundary that gets all the airtime. As you said, right? It's not the boundary that gets all the airtime. And so the boundary that gets all the airtime is frustrating, toxic, whatever range of people that is, whatever spectrum that is, right? Yeah. And I was trying to listen to what you were saying as if it was the first time I'd ever heard you. And right. And so I want to say very out loud that there really are some people who are more difficult to be around or who do hurt people. Right. So as you're speaking in terms of, we need to do our own work of our own neurobiology. I want to say as clearly as I can say it, she's not saying there's not real jerks out there.
Oh my God, no. I mean,
Yeah.
so when I talk about the idea of coming into being in neutrality, for example, right? And to have the experience of not being in judgment of another, this by no means condones bad behavior. In fact, the opposite becomes true. It's just that you just don't care. It doesn't get in,
Mhm.
right? It's kind of hard to explain unless you've started kind of going through the process of this work, but it's just sort of your shitty behavior. Oops, sorry. Your garbage behavior
Yeah.
is just not relevant to me. It's not allowed in here. And learning kind of how to kind of have the boundaries, both energetic, emotional, and like literal with your interpersonal, it's not allowed in here.
Mhm.
And if you want to be that person, carry on.
Mhm.
No, thank you. You're not allowed in here. And this, let's see, very much not condoning bad behavior. It's so important. It's just that it just, how do I want to say this? So neutrality or cause, which either one of these we want to work with, and doesn't matter. It doesn't mean condoning bad behavior. It just means not letting it affect the quality of your experience of your life at that time. You're putting you at the center of your life, maybe for the very first time. And it's nobody else's job to do that, by the way. Like, bad news, but also good news. And when you do that, the more and more you put yourself at the center of your life and you design your life around that, which, by the way, does not have to mean that you then become a narcissistic, selfish jerk. That's not what we're going for here. You know, it's more that classic, am I giving out from a full cup, or am I emptying out the cup and there's nothing left for anybody, including me?
Mhm.
Yeah.
And as I think about it, you and I have connected often and kind of stuff. If you said something, if a stranger on the street that I didn't know said, "Hey, Sarah, you're a real jerk and I hate you," I'd be like, "What? I don't even know them. What? That's weird." Like, whatever. It would be a neutral thing, right? If you said,
Well,
"Hey,
and
Sarah,
their comment has nothing to do with you. Other people's
yes,
judgments of me has nothing to do with me.
yes,
Zero.
yes."
Nothing. Like, people don't understand when they first start talking to me, you can't offend me. And they're like, "Oh no, I can offend you." And I'm like, "No, you really actually can't, because your opinion of me has nothing to do with me. That's all about you."
Yeah, I'm definitely not there yet.
It's hard. I mean, it's hard when you're talking. I
Yet.
think this is where you're going to, Sarah, was like
Yeah.
this idea of, if somebody close to me,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
says something, like, "Oh, you're really like a crappy person and I hate you."
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
that's not a happy moment. But are you going to let it be in charge of your experience at that time?
Mhm.
Yeah. And what I would say is that, because it's a process over time to build up the capacity, there's some deeper stuff here to build up the capacity around neutrality, around cause. And you kind of have these sort of visceral embodied experience in the moment of like, "Oh yeah, I'm more in it here. That feels really good, really empowering." You start to notice that actually the way people around you behave actually changes in response to that. Now, doing it in order to create that doesn't work as well, but it's essentially your own inner energetics.
Mhm.
I'm going to talk about this. They get more and more coherent, right? Like, so instead of all over the place,
Mhm.
in which case then people are essentially free, if you will, to be the one being the organizing principle energetically in the interaction. When you're getting more and more in your center, energetically, esoterically, your own energetics start cohering more, coalescing more. You become more and more the organizing principle for what is the experience you're having in your life, literally, metaphysically, because energy actually is what organizes matter. And also, your energy can change and elevate the interactions that you are in, and it will also naturally push away, gently, even sometimes tumultuously, but just sort of naturally, the people that have been in your life that are not at that level of inner coherence. And that does, because it doesn't feel good, right? You're like, I don't know, why am I letting all these people in my life? It'll just take care of itself. And doesn't mean you have to go around, there's this old Steve Martin, the comedian, there's this old Steve Martin stand-up bit where he does this, like, I break with thee, and then I throw dog poopa on your shoe. And it's this like Like, you don't have to go around and do all of that. It's not necessary. You just focus in here, do the work in specific ways that affect the neurobiology and the somatic side of things, as well as the esoteric energetic side of things. And it just happens. I've worked with thousands of people on this over the years, and it always happens every single time. And it's just an amazing thing. And then what I want to kind of add into that, back to kind of the intuition thing, and sort of how do we discern as we're building these muscles that I'm talking about around personal sovereignty. We also turn on what I call our signal, right? That I like to talk about as cosmic signal, because what I'm really interested in is what's happening in this cosmos and the integration of the cosmic self and the original self into the human, which is the evolutionary jump that our human species is beginning. But we can put that over there. At a very basic level, you want to be tapped into the correct voice inside that tells you what's true and what's not true for you, right? Or I think the easier way to put this is that you're a radio tower. We're all radio towers. So there's the signal you're putting out and there's the signal you're receiving. And you can receive any signal, but what you really want is to get the signal so refined that you're just getting the one that's really the most pristine for you. In the process, when that starts really coming online, here's an inner sensation that can help you with discerning, is this person someone for me to kind of move towards or away? Or is this situation, do I move towards it or do I move away? Is if you come into that centered place and you've got that signal kind of on in general, and hopefully more and more that's just how you're living your life, there's a subtle, almost physical feeling inside of like a magnet, that either there's a kind of a gentle sort of pulling together of the magnet between you and the idea of this person or the idea of this action, or there's a subtle reverse magnet. You know, when you put like magnets against each other that they have like, and it's the same kind. So then they kind of have this field that's like pushes kind of this slight repelling, like you get closer and then whoop, whoop, whoop. You start to feel that. You can only really sense that from pretty close into neutrality, because otherwise all the judgment up or down gets in the way. It creates like a gunky filter that cannot give you correct information for your soul. So that's one of the reasons to do all of that work in many ways, because once you actually get your signal dialed in and you kind of have that immediate, you're just walking around in your day like, yep, nope, yep. You know, it's sort of like an inner game of like hotter, hotter, warmer, warmer, colder, colder, colder. You just know what to do, and it makes life so much easier and so much more simple and really delightful. And it's really the jumping off point into the cosmic embodiment that I find to be very fun and where a lot of my focus is.
Well, that intuition and discernment is my obsession, right? I mean, that is, decision-making skills, discernment, trusting that intuition. And because I was in COVID, there was a situation, there were several people who they died, and there was some close to me in a really bad car wreck and that kind of thing. And it was a season of life that I remember a lot of people saying, wow, how are you still holding up? Yeah. And I was like, here's what I cannot hold up in. Like someone teaching me not to trust myself as far as like gaslighting. I was like, that is my like bad place. Everything else I can manage, handle, even if it is truly bad. There were a lot of bad things happening. And, it was like, what's really, really, really bad is when I lose that trust with the intuition, or I lose my yes and yes and no. And I know there's people, I want to say that out loud because I know there's people listening to this, and it's like, first boundary is like an inner what? Like what? I mean, it's hard to get there. And oh my gosh, I mean, that is truly, well, let's see. In my first book, it's like clear the confusion and learn to trust yourself is the subtitle because my book's right here. Second book, here's a maze with the center, and it said simple complex decisions. Like just in case you're not certain.
Yeah.
That
yeah.
is
We've got a theme. We've got a theme there. Yeah. Well, and that personal sovereignty lesson, I made that available as part of the kind of core background materials in that Joy of Money class, which I think you've accessed those materials. And that's a very low entry in terms of it's not a big expensive private package or anything like that for people. That's available in an evergreen way. And there's some good boundary work in there that is just easy for people to get access to. So that's an option, and we can put links to all this stuff in there. It's really important. I also, for people who really want to kind of go deep just into boundary work, I do also recommend often a woman that I worked with for many years in a variety of different capacities as peers primarily, and collaborators in different things. I would consider her to be one of the global experts on boundaries, actually. And her name is Sari Gilman, Gilman. And she has a book called Transform Your Boundaries. And it's a very sort of simple little book that, can be sort of deceptively like, well, okay, that was that. But if you really dive into that book and use it as sort of almost like a workbook to really work with, it's very radical, really good stuff. A number of years ago, I was running a large corporate organization in my hashtag CEO for Others' Lives. And I brought Sari and her work in. I had known her for many, many, many years. And we, published that book for her and also helped her put together a number of short video lessons on kind of like basic boundary stuff. So it's a good kind of basic place to start. If you're kind of looking for that just simple entry. And then that can help you open up so many other doors within yourself.
And that's what I feel like. So I didn't think I was going to do this, but I would like to describe a tiny bit of how my life has changed from being in touch with that to intuition. And I would love for you to do the same, if we may. So if that does feel so far away. And you also made a comment about not having not living a drama-filled life, which I think is part of this. If somebody's been in a toxic relationship, especially if they grew up in a toxic family, it's like a goldfish swimming around in their own water, right? And maybe it's being in that one down position and feeling powerless, or then switching to judgment and feeling like you're, the only solution is to feel better than everybody else, right? That is, it's just the yucky energy of it, right? It's just that it's like dirty water. Right?
It is like dirty water, but also the neurobiology gets addicted to that particular sort of soup of the neurochemicals, and it will create more circumstances to make sure it gets those chemicals until you do sort of some of that inner deprogramming. So it's useful to understand the biology, because then you can understand like, oh, it's not actually that I'm just like a crazy lunatic that I keep bouncing from one crazy situation to another, right? There are absolutely kind of esoteric core things to work with around why that's happening, but that won't work without also attending to the biological side of it. It's foundational. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to, particularly women, who come in and they've been working on the spirit side and the esoteric side and whatever for ages. And they have all these different like amazing inner experiences or access or blah, blah, and they love it, but it's not sustainable. It's not repeatable. They can't do it on demand, generally speaking. And the rest of their life is still a complete shit show. And they don't understand why. Like, how can I be this magical, magical being and everything's a shit show? Well, because it's the whole package in the human. When the soul comes into the human body, it's doing that from the perspective of, okay, I'm going to play in this very particular form. And I have very specific reasons for wanting to do that. And there are certain things about how that works that need to be attended to. Anyway, but I wanted to hear your story about like how things have changed for you with that.
I'm just thinking about how that changed, and 100% anybody who's worked with me, or if you listen to other pieces of the podcast, 100% agreement on the neurobiology. I've personally done neurobiology work with Melanie. I am like 100% in agreement. I want to, there can be jerks and you can need to work on your neurobiology at the same time. And both of those things right?
Not mutually exclusive at all. Yeah. In
Which I think
fact, when you haven't done the neurobiology work, you're going to be more likely to hang out with jerks and wonder why.
uh, and it's not your fault they're a jerk. All these things are true.
We can just go on for ages with just like the slogans of like facts.
But it does,
facts.
right? Because you get in that like, is it my fault? Is it their fault? Is it what am I supposed to do? What am I in control of? Right. So all the things I'm personally obsessed with. So I for so many years, I did not have that yes. Okay. So I do feel like I had a very strong yes and no as a teenager, way more so than I see most teenagers feeling as if they are, the discernment I was able to pick out from a kid and like seeing certain situations and like, I think something's going on there. I think something's happening with this. I think something's happened with this. And really, it's not super convenient for like a 12-year-old to go around and like tell other people what's not going right in their lives, or, and so it was like, it's not 1 or 2 or 3 times, right? It's like, it's a laundry list of times as a teenager. I was like, I think something's going down over that. Something's happened. I was right. I was right. And every time I was right, it caused me a whole lot of trouble.
Yeah.
Because I was, always
Yep. Well, and you're also a highly gifted person. So there's intuition, which is available to everybody. And then there's what's your brain type, right? Like there are a lot of different brain types, and the atypical form of the brain that falls into this camp of highly gifted, which is just, generally by most people defined as the top 2% of intellectual or creative potential. And this is an intrinsic potential at birth. So this has nothing to do with, getting training or classes or your grades. It has nothing to do with any of that. But the gifted kid, that is a whole experience. The gifted kid, like first of all, the gifted brain, all brains have a totally amazing pattern recognition superpower. Like that is one of the coolest parts of the human brain. Then the gifted brain is that like on steroids, like times 1,000, just like, you see all the stuff, you synthesize the thing, you see the pattern, right away, and you don't understand why other people don't see it that way. Right. But as a kid, that also usually comes along with this like intense kind of fairness, justice gene is what I call it, where it's like ramped up also times 10. So you see weird stuff going down, you see it, others can't see it. And you're like, hi, not okay. Let's fix this. And yeah, of course, if you're in an environment in your family culture and in your kind of close community culture that isn't really interested in, for example, let's just say 12-year-old girls
giving marriage advice,
wisdom or knowledge of any kind or speaking at all, right? Because it's like, we know massively girls are not generally, it's still a problem that girls run into this, like don't speak up, or generally this kind of, children should be seen, not heard kind of idea. In a variety of different, religious, cultural upbringings, we're going to see girls in particular raised with the idea that they're the root of all evil. That's a little bit of a head trip for a little girl growing up. I wonder why she might end up in toxic relationships with men later. So it's a challenge. One of the things that I have found for women in those kinds of situations is that moving through this work is actually the only way that they can then come into a relationship with the divine, if you will, just using that as a placeholder language, because our language doesn't actually matter. It's all the same thing in my personal view. But, to come into that relationship in a way that is not weaponized against you. Really, it's a tough one. And then, on the other side, people who are interested in the esoteric and wanting to, for example, they're interested in manifesting, or they're interested in the law of attraction, or, blah, 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 all these different things that get thrown around. This gets really weaponized against people too, right? Because there are these soundbite versions out there about how do the esoteric metaphysics actually work. And the soundbite version is, your thoughts create things. And so therefore, whatever you're thinking is responsible for why your life is the way it is. And so if you're not basically a bazillionaire living on a beach, it's your fault. Oh my God. It's so like, oh, wait, we went from this to this and we skipped everything in between. Like it's not accurate. And also your thoughts aren't actually the thing that are creating things. It's much more complicated than that. But so if you're doing any of that, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh yeah, I have had this problem, like stop. Do not allow any of this stuff to be weaponized against you. That's just like step one. And then get some good esoteric supports. I have a podcast that has, I don't know, like 105 episodes or something. It's free. You know, it's a master class and all this stuff. I know people who use it as like an ongoing training program for themselves.
No, I listen to every episode twice, I think, and I do. I listen to it. You always send it to me and I listen to it and then I listen to it again. And then it's usually kind of the first time I'm like taking notes of like, is that what I'm experiencing energetically? And it's been fascinating. Like when I wrote my blurb about, I really need to take a break from toxic relationship coaching, I was crying after calls. I was, it was just, I could not heal my own nervous system, and which is exactly what I said. I was like, my neurobiology is having too many reminders for me to get to my next level.
Yeah.
It was too many like reminders.
Yeah. And vicarious traumatization is very real. In early days of my career, one of the program areas that I was responsible for in a large organization was mental health counseling, as well as case management and, folks that were doing direct services work with people who've been through extraordinary trauma. These are adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, coming out of domestic violence relationships, often like a whole bunch of stuff going on. And the vicarious or secondary trauma that comes from that's what you're steeping in all day long, it's real.
Yeah.
And I'm sad to say that it's still the case, 35 years later, that we don't do a good job as a society supporting that. We don't understand it. We don't respect it. We don't care for people who are in those kinds of situations, whether they're professionals or not, because the peer piece is just as traumatic. And we have a lot of really beautiful kind of organic peer things going on. But this idea that you were just talking about like, I can't get away from the remembering of my own experience because it's just a constant reassault within you. What I would also say is that's, I think, fascinating for people to be aware of is that far and away, the helping professions or people who are interested in being professional helpers, they themselves have trauma in their background, and that may or may not be a conscious motivation for why they like, oh, I went through that. I want to help others not have to do that. But if you don't do this work that we're talking about, you're just going to keep making it worse for yourself. It's just a mess. And changing the larger systems and structures that people are working in doing that is not something that I engage with anymore, but I have been involved in that in the past. And it's deep, like you want to talk about, oh, our school system should be trauma informed. Great idea. Okay, how are we going to do that? Oh, well, let's get right in there and like start working with the kids and the teachers. Like these teachers have enormous trauma in their bodies. Even if they didn't come in traumatized, they're traumatized now from having to juggle 30 or 35 kids in a classroom year after year after year without any resources, without, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we don't need my soapbox in any of that, but it's, when you look at change efforts in these larger institutions like schools or places that are service providing entities, it is a long road. Because we have to do we have to give everybody the space to come into what's real inside themselves, which is actually what the whole society needs. And we don't have any space for that anywhere.
And it was interesting. I had a pretty good friend, and I've done 10 years of every work under the sun. I think when I met you, I was like, well, I've done this and 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 this, and I'll try anything, right? And then I have another friend who went through some different experiences, but definitely trauma. And she said, well, I mean, has it been worth it, all that work you did? And I was just like, okay. And getting into that, like trusting my yes, trusting my no. feeling at peace, not feeling like I have to, for years, it was just like, well, just be busy. Right. The Workaholics Anonymous, right. That type of thing. And it
The
was like,
disease of busy.
yeah, I mean, it's, in my mind, it's like, well, it's better than drugs, right. It's better than cocaine, but
Well, and it is, but is that the bar?
correct. But these games our brains play, right? Like, well, it's not as bad as, but just in the deeper work that I've done, of just that yes, just that no. And it's like, that is all I need at this point. And I do want to say, me feeling like it's a yes or a no is all I need. Like that is the way I make decisions. That is how things are. You could disagree with it or not agree, whatever. And I'll just say, okay. And I can truly say, if I had to choose between losing that or losing my arms and legs, it would be an easy decision. Right there, I would not trade anything in the world for that sense that I have.
Yeah.
I think
it's hard won.
It's hard
won. Yeah. I mean, you worked for that, and we do have to work for that. I mean, I know earlier in my life, I didn't have that. I've always been a mystic, if you will. I didn't always use that label. I've always had a extreme experience of that which is outside of the five senses. We'll just leave it at that. I think it's the cleanest way to talk about it. And I didn't have a lot of the inner sort of human structures that I needed in order to be able to work with that. Very challenging, right? And so then, like, you really do get into like a what's real, what's not real, kind of a situation. As I did some of this work within myself, and I will say that with maybe two exceptions at a couple of key points along the way over 30 years, I didn't have any help or guidance. Nothing. Everything was a no. I tried things, but immediately it was like, that's not helping. You don't get it. Right. And part of that was a function of the esoteric. Part of that was a function of the giftedness. The way these things work together, it means that the pool of people who can understand and unpack what's going on for you is like this tiny. It's one of the reasons why I do what I do the way I do it, that I only work with gifted people. It's like, there's a million people out there to work with people who aren't. The society's organized around that. It's not organized around us. It doesn't care. It doesn't understand us. It's more than happy to like reap the benefits of our contributions, but that's where it ends. Mm-hmm. Right. And also super happy to jump on the second there's any failure. Like, you thought you were so thing. I was just doing my thing, but right. So for me, you asked me for like, if I could give an example of how some of that changed when the kind of what I would call the inner signal really was like, so I'm thinking of a time when I had been running a large organization for 5 years that was a kind of a mixture of, if you will, like a social profit or a social venture and a philanthropic organization, managed like an 8-figure fund, worked in philanthropy, worked with governments, worked with private sector, worked with communities, did a lot of different things, had been languishing, had a 40-year history. And I was brought in, it was a turnaround job. And it was essentially like, I was gonna say Off the Map, which is actually my business name, Off the Map with Melanie. So that's making me laugh right now. But it was essentially just like, had gone into utter obscurity, came in, like turned the whole thing around, refreshed everything, got a completely amazing thing going. We grew and grew and grew, became, an absolute top leader in the field. Amazing things were happening. 5 years in, and it was an organization run by board. So it's a structure that had a board, right? Which we see that in certain corporate environments in a lot of different ways in different sectors. And there are reasons that can be a good thing. And there are reasons why I will never work in that kind of structure again. And I don't recommend people, if you have a really strong, big vision that's working, that you put it into that kind of a structure either, for a variety of reasons. So suddenly out of the blue, there was this one person who really wanted to change the strategy, like midstream. And it doesn't matter. All the details don't matter. But basically, in the middle of this big board retreat that we were having, big strategic retreat, myself, my senior management team, the board, suddenly they went into a private session, and this guy who had his own agenda, which was entirely about advancing his own career, he didn't care at all about the work. He convinced them to be afraid of, they had been taking some leaps, and it was working, but it was early on. He convinced them to shut certain things down. And in that moment, when they brought me back in and debriefed on this decision, I had a decision moment myself. And earlier in my career, would have been like, or might have been like, what the, like, that's crazy. Why would you do that? Or, would somehow have engaged with a struggle with them around it. And also would have been like, I would have had just an absolute physical response, that like, that shock in your body, that like horror in your body, that like, stress, and you're just that immediate, like, what's going on? Instead, I was just like, I was very surprised. I did not see it coming. I did see coming that something big was happening that I didn't understand yet. And so I knew that going in that morning. I was like, something really intense is going down, and we'll find out what it is. But still, I didn't know what it was. And when this is what happened, I was like, well, is everybody on this page? Yes. Okay. You understand that stakeholders are going to be really upset and you're going to leave people hanging. Yes. Okay. Do you expect me to stay in the organization and run that? Because that's not happening. Mm-hmm. And it was just really clear. Mm-hmm. And I had this moment of what's the leader I want to be? Mm-hmm. And they were like, well, if you don't want to lead it, then you can leave for the rest of the retreat and we'll just work with the senior team. And I was like, if you want me to leave, I will. But if you want my guidance on how to implement on this for the rest of today, I'm happy to give that. But I won't otherwise. And I'm doing that for the benefit of the team and the stakeholders, to be clear. And I stayed for an entire day. Yeah. And then that night I went home and I started my new business. I was just really clear. I had clear information coming in all the time about what the yes was, what the no was. And I had the inner capacity to act from that place instead of being moved around by what was going on around me. And this was a job I thought I would have been in for the rest of my life.
Well, and I want to go back and like say what I heard from each step of the process, because Melanie's incredibly intuitive. I'm incredibly intuitive. And exactly what she described was, I didn't know exactly what was going to happen. I just knew something was happening. Right. And I describe that as a that's weird moment. So I want everybody to hear that as I'm like screaming what she just said. Rewind it, listen to it again. That's what it feels like. Right. Because sometimes when you say, something doesn't feel right, or it feels like something's about to happen.
Well, and I'll clarify a little bit. Like, yeah. I knew something was going to happen, and I knew it was tied to this one person. And I was sitting outside the meeting. It's like, 6:30 in the morning with my senior team, waiting for things to come together. And I told them, I said, look, I don't know what's going to happen, but you guys need to be ready that I think stuff's going to blow up today. We had no reason to believe that, no evidence whatsoever. And I remember this one woman on my team was like, okay, what does that mean? I'm like, I don't know. I just want you to be like, get in your center and like, be there.
And that is exactly what I'm talking about. So I mean, yes. Okay. So,
and then when it happened, and then they were all brought back into the room, and they were like, what? And they all looked at me like, mother effer, how did you know?
That's what it looks like, ladies and gentlemen. That's what it looks like. And then when you talk to someone else about it, because I had a friend, and it was like, she had a business, and someone was like coming in just kind of in her business's business. And I was like, I just wouldn't go into like business with her. She's asking my advice. I wasn't just telling her, but she was asking my advice. And I said, something's off about her. Something's weird about her. Something's off. Something's there. Right. And it turns out, a few years later, she started a new business almost exactly or a year later, she started a new business, and she was like totally, and if you have those moments in your life please anchor those, because then when that feeling comes up again and you're like, something's up, I think it has something to do with this, right?
Yeah.
Because what you experienced with that lady saying, well, fill in all the details and then I'll believe you. Is exactly where people get thrown off, right? And when you
Right.
believe in that inner knowing of my yes is yes and my no is no, it's like, I don't need all those other details. I trust this.
Yeah. Right. I don't need all those other details. And the more you build that muscle of living in that way that you now are, the more details become available. And that, which is very fun. And you don't need them. It's just fun. And and I want to kind of switch just for a moment to that idea of fun, because actually what this whole crazy experiment of life on this planet at this time is supposed to be about is actually about how do we shift everything into play, into, I'm going to just go full woo for a minute, like the cosmic child embodiment that we actually came here to be in that place of like living the cosmic child, which is living in the wise innocence. And I want to talk about wise innocence for a moment, because it's not just about, oh, I'm reclaiming my innocence, I'm going to go back to that. No, you can never go back, right? Like that's the thing that we should understand. Nor do we want to go back. We want to take that innocence, we want to choose that innocence, and then we want to take the wisdom of our lived experience in this life and others. But let's stay in this life for a moment. The wisdom of lived experience, clear off from those experiences everything that's gunky, everything that's not mine. Also, the gunky stuff that is mine, clear it off, because in the center of every experience, there's like a little jewel that is the wisdom from the lived experience. Living from the place of chosen innocence after experience with the wisdom of it, that is the cosmic child, and that is what we're doing. And it's a game changer. It's the whole next level beyond this, like, okay, I got my yes and no. I figured out how to kind of implement on that. How do I take it to the next level so that everything that I'm doing is fun, is play, is delightful, is easy, that I have infinite energy, that I don't get stuck, that I'm not like, that I don't. So often people will have a sense of, I have a clear sense of urgency around a purpose or a mission that I have in my life. Are you trying to bring that mission to fruition from a place of sort of striving and struggle and I gotta do it, and and it's so hard, and like procrastination and shame and perfectionism and just all the like garbage? Because if you are, like, stop, do everything that we're talking about here one way or another, find ways to do that, because then one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to be able to re-engage with that mission, and it's going to be super easy and fun and delightful in a totally different way, or you're going to realize, I actually don't want to do that mission. That was just my trauma talking. That was my childhood directives programming me to function in a certain way in order to feel safe and to feel included, which are the core drivers of the old evolutionary imperative of the human. The old evolutionary imperative of the human is about survival. So it's about physical safety, but for humans, even more than physical safety, inclusion. The human is a social animal, and inclusion is probably our number one driver. And it's why we stay in really crappy circumstances, even dangerous ones, because at least we feel like there's some connection. And this whole cosmos that we're in, this incredibly beautiful, amazing cosmos, it is designed for differentiated communion. That's the whole thing. So it's this you are a unique energy architecture organized in a way that nothing else in this cosmos is. And your experience is to be as much completely you as you can be. And the more we have that experience of coming into that, what is truly you, what is truly that pure center, your essence, nothing else, then the communion part really gets fun, because when you become essentially, you're unassailable, you're uncorruptible, right? And I don't mean that in like a gunky, whatever BS way, right? This isn't about like, oh, we're virgins with our little wedding dresses on. And that's fine, but it's not what I'm talking about. The stripping away of all the stuff that isn't you to get to what is actually you, then coming into communion with others is totally different. And we crave that communion because that's the design of this cosmos. Sometimes we think that we crave that communion because we're all just one anyway and separation is the problem. That's not this cosmos. That's actually a mistake. Yes, we do often have to deal with the so-called separation wound from essentially leaving being all one source, but that's actually very small compared to the other pieces. Usually that's more about what the human has experienced around abandonment in various ways, not being stood for, not being cared for, not being provided for. And I would say that even most humans who don't have problems in their childhood have trauma in their body, just simply from a function of how dysfunctional modern society has become for humans.
And they still had to get through middle school and high school. Who went through middle and high school?
Well, and there's so much stuff going on there that is super traumatic that also adds to whatever's going on and kind of can really gunk up trajectories for people. I mean, there is a lot of research in the trauma research that talks about the idea of at certain ages in middle school being bullied in certain ways is as damaging to, if you will, I'm going to just go with the nervous system, the neurobiology, whatever, because it also has biological effects on health and other things later on, as sexual abuse by a parent at a younger age.
I believe it.
Which is inconceivable to most people unless you've been bullied or been around it. And then you're like, oh yeah, I believe that.
I believe it. Oh, Melanie, we could talk for years. Okay, so tell people. I know you have a new event coming up. I know.
I do. I had this super fun event. Yes. And so I'll be really clear. It's for people who are highly gifted. So it's just for a small gathering of people. So if you feel like that is you, go learn more about it, and you can ping me through my site if you want to ask more questions. But it's called Becoming Homo Lumens, and it's the first time I've done something like this. So it's 4 hours live. We're going to workshop through the 3 key things that are, if you will, required. So I'm just going to go right on and say it. Required for this experience of the embodied cosmic child that I've been talking about a little bit. And I'm going to work with people live in it. It's going to be very immersive. It's going to be super hands-on. It's going to be super fun. I'm so excited to just go super deep, all in, like, let's do it, right? So that's at my site, and we'll put the link in here for people. melaniegillespie.com is my site. And so it's easy to find me. And I also have a ton of free stuff available for people that is just part of like my organization. They're not done as promotions. They're part of gifted people are happy when they are creating and transmitting in the ways that work for them, and the rhythms and the modalities are organized around them. So that's actually a big part of my work, is helping people figure that out for themselves, because often we don't actually know what that looks like, or it changes over time. So I do work privately with people, just a handful of people at a time. It's an incredibly intense, energetic container for me, and I hold it completely sacred. I also have a small group program that is super magical just for women. In my private work, I work with men, I work with couples, I work with women. When I'm working with couples, it's not relationship repair. So it's couples that are super strong, and it's all about this, like the evolutionary leap, evolutionary acceleration for the highly gifted. What are you here to experience and be? Because it's something that's never existed before anywhere in the cosmos. So there's no maps. There's no like little walking trails. There's nothing. And I'm just an evolutionary guide. So I'm just like going to walk with you side by side. And I've been around a bunch of different parts of this mountain, so I have some wisdom to share, but your path up the mountain is yours.
I love it. So Melanie, thank you so much for coming, sharing. I loved your work on personal sovereignty. In that deep, and one thing I want to say before we, wrap up is, one of the things you talk about is, just the play of process. Like, it's like, okay, this is a lifetime thing, right? So, I am infinitely better at boundaries than I used to be. And right. I'm infinitely better at, not being gaslit and right, and it's this process, right? And at different times in my journey, when people would say, trust the process or you're in the process, I mean, it was almost at some points, it was like I would feel like a gorilla was coming out of my body and I wanted to beat people up. Like that was such a painful thing for me to hear and experience, and the hurt.
Well, and trust is exhausting. I mean, this is one of the reasons I'm doing this event actually, is because people don't understand that trust is exhausting. Trust is a doing state, not a being state, and it is exhausting. And we actually are in this phase of, I call the trust tribulations phase. So like, yeah. And when people tell you just trust, it's like sometimes that can be great, but oftentimes it can be like, no, you don't see me, you don't get it, you're not helping, But the fun part, like you got to get into the fun. Like I just got this message the other day from a new client who came in, and she's just kind of getting started with all this stuff. And she really needed help with working through, she'd been really badly taken advantage of by somebody else in the kind of the coaching space. And I knew a little bit of that, but I didn't realize how bad it was until she was like, okay, boom, here's what actually is going on and what happened and what I'm trying to navigate. Can you help me with kind of the boundary side? And we worked through it, and I gave her some good stuff, and it totally helped, totally worked. She was actually able to kind of resolve the situation very well. And at some point she was like, in the middle of it, she sent me this message about like, oh, I'm like, I want to do this, but I want to do this. And I was like, well, that's because blah, 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 blah. And I said it, and she was like, oh my God. She's like, first of all, that's totally spot on. And also, how do you make this fun? How is it possible that this can be fun? I was like, because it can be fun. Like all of this inner work, this work of becoming what we want to be, like it actually can be fun. So much of it is organized to be this giant slog. Like I talk a lot about, like, I use a lot of metaphors about like walking up the mountain or hiking up the mountain, or like, the cosmic drive of, we like to do like, cosmic base jumping. We love the adrenaline of the new esoteric experience. I am not one who likes to do the death march up the mountain. Like I like to trip and tra la la and fla la la and do cartwheels. Like that's how we should be living our lives. So it has to be fun. And, we might cry for a moment here and there, but if it's not fun, like something's really wrong. Look at that.
There was a girl, she asked me dating advice a while back, and she said, I can't decide if I should stay with this guy or not. It's probably the happiest I've ever been in a relationship, but blah, blah, blah. And the blah, blah, blah was like, not toxic. It was just, and I said,
it was like, he wears blue on Sundays, or whatever.
Yeah. I was like, I mean, doesn't like you being happy count? Like is that like okay, right? Is that enough? And honestly, that was one when I switched, and I thought, am I really giving myself permission to be happy? Because I would see I would see other people who they were very intelligent, right? And it was just like,
yeah,
what's happening? Like, and I think there's the first 7 years or whatever, a lot of us have that, the idea that if it's difficult or if we like make it hard, we're like do that martyr thing, then it's like somebody somewhere along the line is going to give us a gold star. And Melanie, have you ever gotten a gold star for that? I haven't.
Yeah, no, that is not, they're not giving out gold stars for that.
They're not giving out, but
that's those childhood directives.
Yes. It's like, I mean, so many women.
But that's also the training around like the communications piece around neutrality and cause, where if we're trained to be passive aggressive, we're going to be passive aggressive. I'll just keep giving out the stars. I'll keep giving out all the things in hopes that somebody will do it back to me, which is why I get furious when people are like, oh, it's the golden rule. Like, no, fuck that. It's the platinum rule. Don't treat others how you want to be treated. Treat them how they want to be treated. And learn how do you want to be treated, and then tell people that's how you want to be treated, because they're not psychic. Like,
yeah. Oh, we're going to end on that because they've heard me say that before. Tell people. You have to tell them.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, so good. Well, yeah, so good. So it's super fun. Come see me on the podcast, Luminosity. We'll put the link in below. Come play with me at Becoming Homo Lumens. It's Friday, August 11th. It's going to be an amazing 4 hours. Super fun, tons of bonus goodies, all the good things. you're interested in playing with money energies in their highest form, go grab Joy of Money. It's a super easy, little accessible, but incredibly powerful course that people have been loving.
I love it. And I'll put all that in the links. I know this is going live in several things and
and the lake. We didn't even talk about the lake, but there's a whole podcast episode that's about how the lake house happened and how the lake found me. The lake drew me into it, told me I was going to come live here for a certain time period, told me about the first house that I called Lake House 1 because I knew there was going to be a Lake House 2, but I didn't know when or where. And then now I'm at Lake House 2 and it's just hilarious. So it's a really funny episode actually. So it's a good story. Too long for here.
Well, thank you, Melanie. It has been fabulous. And, goodbye to our audience. And yes,
thank you for inviting me to play.
And yes, so awesome. Thanks.